Winter squash, such as pumpkins, acorn, and butternut squash, are some of my favorite vegetables to grow. I've always found watching the fruits grow from little green orbs into bulbous and colorful fruits to be an especially gratifying part of gardening. As with all plants, though, winter squash present their own unique challenges that can negatively affect harvests. And recently, I ran into one of those challenges in my own garden, and I thought it might be worth sharing the workaround that I used. And honestly, since I do need to pad this vid for time a bit to please the algorithm, I'll also be touching on how I feed my squash plants and just maybe giving an overall update on, how my squash are doing this year. I'd completed most of this video when it dawned on me that the method on which this video focuses hinges on the viewer knowing the difference between a male and female squash flower, and that beginner gardeners might not know how to tell the two apart. So here's a quick overview. Female squash flowers, like these here, will have a miniature fruit at their base. The reproductive part of the flower, called the stigma, which is center frame here, receives pollen from the male flowers, hopefully leading to healthy fruit set. Now here we have a male squash flower. Some, like this one here, have a small bulb at the base, which at a glance can be mistaken for an immature fruit. This is actually the nectary, which, as its name implies, is a reservoir for nectar to attract pollinators. The true telltale that you're looking at a male flower is the distinct shape of the reproductive part called the stamen, shown here. Ideally, this will be covered in the pollen needed to fertilize the female flower. So recently, this bed here, full of acorn squash, really started to take off and a number of beautiful, healthy female flowers began to bloom. The problem was, there wasn't a male flower in sight, and without pollen from male flowers, the female flowers would ultimately shrivel and fall off. I really didn't want that to happen, and luckily there was a workaround. Acorn squash are of the species Cucurbita pepo. This delicata squash is also of the species Cucurbita pepo and had male flowers blooming but no females. So even though both plants have outwardly very different physical characteristics in terms of their fruits, they are of the same species. It's sort of like how a pug and a Great Dane look very different outwardly, but they're both dogs. This means I can use the delicata flower to pollinate my acorn squash. And the procedure for this is as simple as it gets. First, you're going to want to carefully remove the petals of the male flower as shown here, and then gently roll the stamen of the male flower around the stigma of the female flower, trying to transfer as much pollen as you possibly can. Let's see if it worked. Here's the same bed of squash 2 weeks later, and we now have a good handful of fruits well on their way to maturity. Of course, now there's plenty of male flowers on these plants, but not a lot of available female flowers. All of the fruits seen here are the result of pollination from either delicata squash flowers or zucchini flowers, which are also a pepo squash variety. I have to say the fruits at this stage are a bit actually unsettling to look at, and I'm half expecting some kind of alien parasite to hatch out of one of them any day now. While this cross-pollination method is a useful tool, there are some caveats to keep in mind. First, you can only cross-pollinate between squash members of the same species. For example, you can totally pollinate a butternut squash with a flower from a Seminole pumpkin, as both are Cucurbita machata, but you couldn't pollinate a butternut squash with a zucchini flower, as the zucchini is a totally different species, Cucurbita pepo. Next, seed savers should be aware that while the current generation of cross-pollinated fruit will be true to the variety, plants grown from the seeds of that fruit will be a cross that may or may not be desirable. To me, an acorn squash zucchini mix doesn't sound very appealing, but opinions on that will probably vary. Finally, you might run into a situation where no male flowers are available on any of your plants, and unfortunately, there's no workaround there. Sometimes you're just screwed. Alright, since YouTube favors longer videos, I'm now blatantly going to pad for time a little bit with an update on how my squash plants are doing, which to summarize is surprisingly great. Also, I'm going to be touching on how I feed and fertilize these notoriously nutrient-hungry plants. The squash variety that's been the primary focus of this video is called Thelma Sanders sweet potato. That's an acorn squash variety. And I thought it was going to be a bush habit squash, but it turned out to be more of a short vine habit. I had to wrangle them in with a bit of a makeshift squash corral here made from cheap lumber and other materials I had lying around. Thankfully, it looks like their growth is starting to taper off a bit, and hopefully we're more or less looking at the plant's maximum size. These 3 butterbush squash here made a surprising comeback after taking substantial slug damage early in their lives, and it looks like some blossoms are going to open any day now. Because I wasn't sure if those butterbush squash were going to make it, I started these 3 backups a little on the late side this year. I don't think these are going to blossom before the extreme heat settles in and causes pollination issues, but the variety itself is pretty heat tolerant, so I should get at least a few extra squash out of these plants. My golden nugget squash plants have gone absolutely gangbusters and are now loaded with immature fruits. Of course, not all of these are going to make it, but the sheer number of them is a really good sign. These are one of my favorite winter squash varieties, producing what are these sweet-fleshed baseball to sometimes softball-sized fruits that actually resemble miniature pumpkins like you're seeing here. I have a total of 5 of these bush delicata squash going, and as with my acorn squash, I've been hand-pollinating the female flowers with any old male Peppo variety flower that happened to be available at the time. And it looks like it's working since I'm seeing a number of these fast maturing fruits developing on the plants. So now it's time to go on to my front yard squash, which I planted in my recently installed raised beds. These 3 butterbush squash took some heavy slug damage early on, but have recovered to the point of blossoming. Unfortunately, I'm having the same issue with these plants as I was with my acorn squash plants, a scarcity of male flowers. That means a lot of these immature fruits aren't going to make it because I don't have any other machada varieties, which is what butternut squash are, available to steal any male flowers from. So I kind of just have to wait it out and really hope that male flowers start blossoming soon, so I don't lose any more of these immature fruits. And like most of my other squashes this year, these Table King acorn squash got badly munched by slugs, but are now making somewhat of a comeback. Now, there's a good amount of immature fruits on them, but it remains to be seen how many will actually reach maturity. I also have some whitefly and aphid problems that I've been fighting with these plants that certainly aren't going to be good for it. And while I don't get super excited about zucchini, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention them, as they're really doing pretty good, starting to produce at a rate where I'm harvesting at least one every other day. I'm up to about 4 pounds from the 3 plants that I have going at this point. Every now and then I like to let a volunteer squash grow and see if anything neat comes of it. This year I'm letting 2 go. On this one, judging by the leaf shape, I'm sure it's some kind of Peppo variety. The 3 lobes and overall maple to oak shape of the leaf is a kind of a dead giveaway. The rounded fruits at the base of the female flowers could mean pumpkins, which would be cool, or it could be some kind of summer squash, which I really don't need more of. I'm a little concerned about the yellow blotching on the leaves of the new growth. Hopefully that is just some insect damage and the plant will recover. This one is definitely some kind of machada variety or butternut derivative, as is indicated by the telltale white splotches on the leaves and the leaf shape themselves. Now, there's no female flowers yet, so I can't speculate on what variety this might be, but given what I grew last year, it's probably some kind of black futsu butternut squash cross. Unfortunately, it isn't really practical for me to shade cloth my volunteer squashes, so whether or not these survive long enough to bear fruit depends on how long the heat holds off this year. This year I'm trying to remember that winter squash plants are very heavy feeders, and I have a lot of them packed into fairly small raised beds, so I need to feed them regularly. My workhorse fertilizer is typically an organic granular like this citrus tone here. I like the citrus tone due to its higher phosphorus and potassium numbers, but any similar product will definitely work. I churned some of this into the soil at the time of planting, and then I also apply about every 2 weeks as a soil drench. To prepare the soil drench, I just mix about a cup of the granular into 5 gallons of the chlorinated water and let it sit overnight, or maybe 2 days at most. I'll then distribute a 5-gallon bucket to each one of my 6 by 3 foot raised beds. In recent years, I've also been adding potassium sulfate, also known as sulfate of potash, to my feeding routine. Potassium really aids in the development of healthy roots and fruits, and I've noticed it's been especially helpful to my squashes and my root vegetables as well. I just add about a third a cup of this stuff to my 5-gallon soil drench about once a month. I've also started to integrate a bit of Miracle Grow into my feeding routine this year. I do greatly prefer the organic fertilizers as they help to actually build soil as you use them, and they're less expensive by weight and harder to accidentally overdo and damage plants. That said, I'm finding that when used in moderation and in accordance with the label, it's good stuff for giving stalled and struggling plants a kickstart. It's important to note that my fertilizer routine is working on my plants in my garden and might not have the same effect in anyone else's garden. So if you decide to try any of the fertilizers I just mentioned, please don't apply them to all of your plants at once. Test them out first on a plant or two, and just to make sure that they're going to have the desired effect that you want. I'm not a botanist or any other sort of scientist. I develop my methods largely by trial and error and a little degree of research. So if I try something and it works out or it fails, I'm going to report that honestly, but what I do should really be seen as more of a suggestion than gospel. And that'll about do it for now. While there's still a lot that can go wrong between now and when my squash are ready for harvest, what I'm seeing so far is encouraging. And my hand pollination routine really does seem to already be improving potential yield. So until next time, let's hope it all doesn't die.